Hello, my name is Edslev Andersen, and I will give a talk on my and Brad Ray's research on authorship in collaborative research. Let us start by taking a look at the front page of two research papers. It is easy to say who the author of the paper on the left is. The author is Juliet A. Girard. If we instead look at the paper on the right, it is much harder to say who the authors of the paper are. Are all the researchers listed on the byline authors of the paper individually, or are some of the researchers listed on the byline authors of the paper individually? Or do the researchers as a team together constitute one collective author of the paper? It is important to sort out who the author or authors of the paper on the right are for a number of reasons. For example, before we can sort out what it takes to be a good author, it seems that we have to sort out who the authors in collaborative research even are. Before we move on to speak about our own work on the topic of authorship in collaborative research, we will very briefly speak about work previously done on this topic. Philosophers who've discussed authorship in collaborative research tend to focus on the beliefs of individual team members. We will very briefly give you two examples of this focus on beliefs in work on authorship. Josh Hapgood-Coote argues that we should let go of the notion of author in the context of collaborative research. On the slide, I've tried to illustrate one of the types of cases Hapgood-Coote has considered. We're here looking at a number of scientists, in this particular case, 3 scientists, who have contributed to a paper that claims that something P is the case. The paper claims P, but in fact only 2 of the scientists believe P, and the 3rd scientist believes that P is not the case. Hapgood-Coote emphasizes that this type of situation will often arise in collaborative research, and he uses this fact to argue that we should get rid of the notion of author in collaborative research. Hai-Sin Dang has considered the same type of case as Hapgood-Coote, but she argues that the 3 scientists can disagree on whether P is the case and still be good and responsible authors of the paper that claims that P. Dang and Hapgood-Coote and some other philosophers who've discussed authorship in collaborative research have focused on the beliefs of individual team members. In this talk, we shift the focus from beliefs to actions. We wish to consider actions rather than beliefs and see where the focus on actions leads us with respect to the topic of authorship. The remainder of this talk will be about authorship and actions. To begin with, we will talk about scientific authorship in general, and then later we will talk about authorship in collaborative research in particular. In science, generally, the notion of author is recognized to involve both credit and responsibility. As put by David Shapiro and collaborators, in practice, the signing of scientific papers by their authors serves 2 fundamental purposes. It confers credit, and it denotes responsibility for the research. We take this to be accurate and to mean that the author of a paper is whoever did the work reported in the paper, because whoever did the work reported in the paper is who should be credited and held responsible for the work. So when we want to determine who the author of a paper is, we have to ask, who did the work reported in the paper? And whoever did the work reported in the paper is responsible for the work. This responsibility involves an obligation to defend, revise, or retract the paper if the work is challenged. Note that the key words here are action words. Our focus on actions in determining who the author of a paper is means that the normative question of what it takes to be a good author of the paper is also primarily concerned with actions. To see this, we have to think about the key features characterizing authorship on our account. On our account, if S is the author of a paper, this means that S performed the actions that produced the paper, and that S is responsible for performing the further actions of defending, revising, or retracting the paper if the work reported in the paper is challenged. So in order to determine what it takes for us to be a good author of the paper, we should ask what it means for us to do a good job at performing the actions I just mentioned. In other words, in order to determine what it takes for us to be a good author of the paper, we should ask, how should us have performed the actions that produced the paper? And how should us go about defending, revising, or retracting the paper if the work reported in the paper is challenged? What we've said about authorship and actions so far has concerned authorship in general. We will now focus on the topic of authorship in collaborative research in particular. More specifically, we will focus on the question of who the author of a collaborative paper is in the remainder of the talk. We may ask what answers to this question could look like. We may find that the author of a collaborative paper is the research team as a whole, or some or all of the individual team members. One reason why the question of who the authors of collaborative papers are is important is that we need to know who the authors of collaborative papers are before we can ask what it means for this kind of author to be good and responsible. In order to answer the question of who the author of a given collaborative paper is, we need to ask the question of who did the work reported in the paper. This follows from what we said earlier about authorship and actions. In order to answer the question of who did the work reported in a collaborative paper, Brad Ray's characterization of research teams as having organic solidarity is useful. Ray writes that a group or community is characterized by organic solidarity when its members depend upon the proper functioning of the other members, and when the members of the group or community are organized so as to advance a goal. Ray argues that research teams are often characterized by organic solidarity when they do the work reported in a paper. There's often a pronounced division of labor between the members of a research team and a dependence upon the actions and knowledge of other members of the team. And in fact, the result of the work, the published paper, is a consequence of the concerted efforts of the team members. This means that when a research team is characterized by organic solidarity, as research teams often are, the research team as a collective did the work reported in the paper. On our conception of authorship, this means that a collaborative paper is often authored by a team as a single collective author. Finally, our claim that research papers are often authored by research teams as collectives is also supported by data we recently collected on retraction practices in science. On our account of authorship, if a research team is the author of a paper, this means that the research team as a collective did the work reported in the paper, and that the research team as a collective is responsible for defending, revising, or retracting the paper if the work reported in the paper is challenged. Our data suggests that research teams tend to take responsibility as a collective if there turns out to be a substantial problem with the work reported in their paper. I will not have time to speak in detail about our data, but I will say a couple of things. We found that the retraction of a collaborative paper is usually made by the research team itself, rather than individual team members or the editor of the journal. Furthermore, we found that when the research team makes the retraction, the team also tends to take responsibility for what went wrong as a collective. Generally, the team does not identify any individual team member as responsible for what went wrong, except in cases where an individual is believed to have betrayed the team by committing misconduct. And misconduct is not the principal cause of retraction. To sum up, we have made two main claims in this talk. We have argued that we should think of authorship in terms of actions. Furthermore, we've argued that in the case of collaborative papers, it is often the research team as a collective that is the author of the paper. On our account of authorship in terms of actions, to say that the team as a collective authored the paper is to say that the team as a collective did the work reported in the paper and is responsible for defending, revising, or retracting the paper if the work reported in the paper is challenged. Okay, this is the end of the talk on my and Brad Ray's research on authorship and collaborative research. Thank you for watching this video.